Good morning. Running a couple minutes late this morning. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this beautiful Lord's Day that you bless us with, Father, and pray for all the blessings you've given us, and pray for the opportunity we have to assemble together this morning, Father, and pray for this Bible class hour we can study your word and learn more from it, Father, and pray that we'll always be good stewards of your word. Pray your blessings as we study from your word this morning, Father, and pray that we can rightly divide it and better learn what our duties are to you, Father, and pray for your forgiveness for any sins that are missed in our life, and know that we're human and we sin each day, and just pray for your continued blessings upon us, Father, and bless us as we go into the worship hour here shortly, Father, and pray that everything we do during that time is done in a way that's pleasing to you as well. Pray for your continued blessings upon Valdosta and every member here, every family here, Father, and thank you for those that have been able to return to us that were sick, and just pray for your continued blessings upon all those, Father, that we're mindful of that are sick or hurting, that need prayers on their behalf, and pray you'll bless each and every one of them as only you can, Father, and as you know that they need. And again, pray for your blessings upon us as we open your word this morning, Father. Pray that we can study your word with open minds and open hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. So we'll continue our study in Matthew chapter 24 this morning. So last week we finished what I called the section 2, or the additional predictions that Jesus gave concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. So if we go to just a brief review here of our overall basic outline, so we covered the overall context, Matthew 24 verses 1, 2, and 3. We're in the second section here, predictions concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. This goes from verses 4 to 34. So this morning we'll start in verse number 15, where Jesus starts giving predictions of the Great Tribulation. And as we've been making the connection or the comparison this whole time of each section to a GPS. So the initial predictions were, this would be equivalent to your GPS telling you 2 miles, your destination is coming up, and then the additional predictions would have been in a quarter of a mile, your destination is coming up. So now, in this section, from about verse 15 to 28, and we'll see in mainly verses 15 and 16, Jesus gives these predictions of the Great Tribulation. This would be the equivalent of your GPS telling you to turn right now. So the GPS, the destination is the time to flee Jerusalem, and Jesus is giving his disciples the sign that they will need to look for when it's time to flee Jerusalem. So this morning we'll start verses 15 through 28, or we'll start in verses 15. We'll probably get through verses 15 and 16 maybe, and then we'll go from there. But before we get started in the study, I think it's helpful to point out a few things regarding specifically the term, the Great Tribulation. So first, when we use the term in our study, the Great Tribulation, we're not using the term in the manner that a lot of the religious world would use the term Great Tribulation. So a lot of the religious world uses that term to reference a specific time of 7 years that fits into the premillennial doctrine. So we're not using it in that reference. We're using it in the way that Jesus references it in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 21 as a period of great tribulation. He says in verse 21, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." So it's not part of the doctrine of premillennialism. It's just a period of time mentioned by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24. So when we use the term Great Tribulation, that's what we're referring to. Second, the Great Tribulation is not the destruction of Jerusalem itself. It's the period immediately preceding the destruction of Jerusalem. So that can be a little bit confusing, where we think that maybe the tribulation is the destruction itself, but it's actually not. It's referring to a period that applies specifically to Jesus' disciples, and we'll see that as we go through the study. But the period of the Great Tribulation applies strictly to Jesus' disciples and all the Christians that follow him. And it happens right before the destruction of Jerusalem. We can see that because, again, in verse 21, he says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." And then in verse 29, he says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken." So from about verse 29 to 31 or so, Jesus uses some apocalyptic language to describe the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll talk about that when we get there. But a lot of commentators, a lot of people will try to apply that to the second coming, that he's talking about his second coming in verse 29 through 31. And we'll show why that's not true when we get there. But he's actually talking about the destruction of Jerusalem itself. So verse 21, he says there's going to be great tribulation. And then verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the destruction of Jerusalem is going to come. So we can see that the great tribulation is the time immediately preceding the destruction of Jerusalem. Third, just want to make note that the abomination of desolation, we'll study about that this morning and probably next week. The abomination of desolation is the only sign that Jesus gives that signals anything to be done. So if you remember all the way back from starting in verse 4, Jesus gives all these signs, things that are going to come to pass. It's earthquakes and pestilences and famines, and he talks about the persecution of the church and how they're going to be brought before kings and rulers and killed, and all these things are going to happen. But there's no action, required on the disciples' part for those signs. Jesus tells them that these signs are going to come to pass, but like he says specifically in verse 6, the end is not yet. And then he tells them in the second part there that the end is not going to come until the gospel has been preached to the whole world. It's not until we get to verse 15 and 16 that he tells them when you see the abomination of desolation, that's the only time that you need to do something. So in verses 15 and 16 he says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So there's no other time, there's no other sign that Jesus has given that required the disciples or his followers to do anything. So it's just important to note that the sign of the abomination of desolation is the only sign that Jesus gives that actually signals anything that it's time to do anything. So with that in mind, I think that to me personally, the phrase "the abomination of desolation" is not really it's not really self-evident, right? What is that referring to? You don't necessarily read that term and just understand what it's talking about. We see that Jesus references a prophecy by Daniel, so I think it's important for us to understand, what is the abomination of desolation. So we'll spend a little bit of time this morning talking about that. I think that to understand verses 15 to 16, then we need to answer these three questions. First, what is the abomination of desolation? Second, what is the holy place that we'll be standing in? That's important because even if we know what the abomination of desolation is, it has to be standing in the holy place. So we have to understand what that holy place is. And also, why does this signal to those in Judea that they need to flee to the mountains? So these are going to be the three questions we're going to try to answer probably this week and next week. Hopefully we can answer, actually we won't even be able to complete the first one this week. We'll complete most of the first one this week, and hopefully we can answer these other questions next week. But if we want to think about, answer the question, what is the abomination of desolation? If we wanted to dig into that, where do we start? Well, Jesus gives us a hint. He mentions that it was mentioned by Daniel the prophet. So we know we can at least go back to Daniel and look and see what Daniel says about the abomination of desolation. Turns out that Daniel uses this term 3 times in the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel has 12 chapters. and he mentions the abomination of desolation. Sometimes the wording is a little bit different, but he uses that term 3 times, once in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, and then Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. So Daniel, the book of Daniel, contains 12 chapters. They were written over many years, and in most scholars will agree that they were not written in the order that they're given in the Old Testament. So generally it's accepted that the writings of Daniel, these 12 chapters, span pretty much most of his life, most of his time in captivity, in Babylonian captivity. And so he didn't sit down and write the book all at once. He wrote it over most of his life. And then, the order that we have the chapters is not the order that Daniel wrote the chapters. That becomes, I think, just, a little bit significant when we start talking about looking at the prophecies that Daniel has given and trying to understand, what these apply to. But there's not a real good consensus on the order that the chapters were written in. So most scholars will agree that they're not written in order that we have them, but there's not a lot of agreement, or not a good consensus on what order were they actually written. But I think Rex Turner, in his book, Daniel, a Prophet of God, gives a good explanation, makes a good argument for the chronology of the chapters that he gives. So in our view for studying the abomination of desolation, we'll look at it from the timeline that Rex Turner lays out. And I think it makes sense. We'll see sort of the progression of those prophecies and how they apply. I think it helps in our study of understanding what the abomination of desolation actually is. So we'll go through these 3 instances of when Daniel mentions the term abomination of desolation. We'll try to decipher what is the prophecy talking about, and does it apply to Matthew chapter 24. So when we find the one that applies to Matthew chapter 24, that should help us understand what Jesus is talking about. What is the abomination of desolation in Matthew chapter 24? Being the sign for the disciples and those in Judea to flee to the mountain. So we'll start studying Daniel this morning. We should get through 2 of these. We probably won't get through all 3 of them. But first, before we do that, I think it's helpful just to try to understand the definition of the words abomination of desolation. So the term itself kind of means something in particular. But if we look at the words, so abomination, this is the Hebrew word, means detestable or abominable thing, and actually the Greek word is very similar anyway, so they both mean more or less the same thing. Detestable or abominable thing, and it's usually used in reference to idolatry. So if you think about the worship of idols, how God would view His followers worshiping idols, that's an abomination to God. So the term, the word abomination sort of has that inclination or that meaning that it's some sort of detestable thing to God, and it would be similar to the worship of idols, or how God would view the worship of idols. Desolation, I think probably the best way to define that word is to see how it's used. So the word desolation is the same word used, recorded by Jeremiah when he talks about Jerusalem being desolate after Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes Judah into Babylonian captivity. So remember, during Jeremiah's prophecy of that event, he talks about how the city of Jerusalem is going to be desolate. It's going to be desolate because it's going to be empty. It's going to be destroyed. Talks about how it's going to be more or less a mocking of the nations around, how they'll mock the Jews because of how they were punished by their own God because they didn't follow their own God. But the idea of that desolation of Jerusalem is the same idea inferred here in the abomination of desolation. But I think this will make it'll make a little bit more sense as we see it used. But in general, the term is used to refer to some type of abomination, some type of detestable thing that brings with it, some form of desolation. Is more or less the best way to define it, I think. So if we go back to Daniel, the first time we see, so at least in the progression, in the timeline that Rex Turner lays out in his book of Daniel, as far as when did Daniel use this term first, it would have been in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 31. And so we don't have, we could spend a whole lot of time deciphering the chapter of Daniel, this chapter of Daniel 11, and trying to go through and see who the king of the north is, who the king of the south is. And there's a lot of information in Daniel chapter 11 that I don't think it's it's a good study, but for our study, it would take an awful lot of time for us to go through that. So I'm not going to go through the entire chapter. We'll focus on verse 31, where Daniel uses the term abomination of desolation. But I think we can summarize of what's going on here and just focus on what's important for our study. So Daniel chapter 11 verse 31 says, "An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So just if we just sort of focus on the time here and what's being mentioned. So this is the sanctuary of strength, would obviously be God's sanctuary. So we know that Daniel was in Babylonian captivity at this time, but it's already been prophesied by Jeremiah, that they would come out of Babylonian captivity after 70 years. So Daniel is talking about a time once Judah has returned to Jerusalem. So the sanctuary of strength is going to be polluted. The daily sacrifice is going to be taken away. This would obviously be the daily sacrifice offered by the priests under the Jewish law. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So what does all that mean? Well, I don't think I've read a single commentator who did not agree that this event is talking about the siege of Jerusalem by a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and we'll look at him in a minute. He besieged Jerusalem and took Jerusalem, a couple hundred years or so B.C. But there's pretty much a consensus from all I've seen of scholars and commentators who all agree that Daniel is prophesying here in Daniel chapter 11 about this event of Antiochus IV taking over Jerusalem and setting up the abomination that maketh desolate. So just a little background on him. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a Greek king. He ruled the Seleucid Empire from about 175 B.C. to about 168 B.C. He besieged Jerusalem, he took it, and he controlled the city for about 3.5 years. And during that time, he stopped the daily sacrifice. So the sacrifice of the Jews was not allowed to be made for 3.5 years. And not only that, he placed his own altar on top of God's altar at the temple and sacrificed a sow on that altar. So we know that would have been a great desecration, since a sow would have been an unclean animal, right? So he sets his own altar on top of God's altar, makes his own sacrifice of an unclean animal, and then stops the Jews from offering their sacrifices for 3.5 years. So Josephus actually makes two mentions of this, of Antiochus' the siege of Jerusalem, in two of his different writings. He says, at the time when Antiochus, known as Epiphanes, he took the city of Jerusalem, he took it by storm, killed a large number of Ptolemy's adherents, and gave his soldiers unlimited license to plunder. He himself despoiled the temple and put an end to the daily continuity of sacrifice, an interruption which lasted for 3.5 years. And then Josephus also says, and that from among them should arise a certain king that should overcome our nation and their laws, and should take away their political government, and should spoil the temple, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 3 years' time. And indeed, it so came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years before they came to pass. So even Josephus, many years ago, him being a Jewish historian, he would be familiar with the prophecies of the Old Testament. He'd been familiar with the Old Testament. He even attributed Daniel's vision in Daniel chapter 11 to Antiochus. So, and even since Josephus, all modern scholars, they generally attribute this prophecy in Daniel chapter 11 to Antiochus. So, from this account, from this prophecy, what is the abomination of desolation? How does this apply to what we're talking about or what Daniel gives here? So the abomination in this instance is due to the desecration of God's altar. So remember, think about the word abomination refers to generally like idolatry or some detestable thing like idolatry. Well, here you have a desecration of God's altar by basically a pagan king setting up an altar on top of God's altar and then offering an unclean animal on top of God's altar. So that's a desecration. So the abomination comes from that desecration, and then the desolation part comes from the fact that he took away the sacrifice for 3.5 years. So we can see when Daniel references the abomination that maketh desolate in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, that's what he's referring to. There was a desecration of God's altar, and the sacrifice was taken away for 3.5 years. Like I said, there's pretty much a unanimous consensus on this. I haven't seen any scholars or commentators who disagree with that interpretation. But it doesn't sound like this is the instance of the abomination of desolation that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 24. So I think we can conclude that out of the three instances that Daniel gives, it's not the instance in Daniel chapter 11 that Jesus is referring to. So the next, again, in the chronology given by Rex Turner, the chapters would go Daniel 11, 12, and 9 as far as the time frame that Daniel had written them. So if we move on to Daniel chapter 12, we'll read verses 9 through 12, give a little bit extra context here to this chapter. Starting in verse number 9, and he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,305 days. And that's the end of the chapter. So verse 12 is the last verse there in Daniel chapter 12. So I think that this one is a little bit harder to decipher, in my opinion, than Daniel chapter 11. But I think first we need to notice two things about this context. First, the daily sacrifice will be taken away and the abomination of desolation set up. Those things happen more or less simultaneously from the context here. Second, we have a period of 1,290 days. This follows the abomination of desecration being set up. And then we have a period of 1,335 days. But it looks like those two time periods overlap. So you've got 1,290 days. The 1,290 days and the 1,335 days run concurrently, right? So then the 1,335 days runs out a little bit after the 1,290 days. We'll talk about this more as we get into it. But generally, this is what I think we can make these two conclusions from this chapter, that there's going to be 1,290 days after the abomination of desolation is set up. The daily sacrifice is going to be taken away at the same time that it is set up, and that the 1,290 days, the 1,335 days run concurrently, and that the 1,335 days runs out a little bit after the 1,290 days. So it turns out that 1,290 days is about 3.5 years. And this is the same amount of time that Antiochus Epiphanes ruled over Judea and prevented the daily sacrifice from being offered. So a lot of scholars and commentators will attribute this prophecy to Antiochus as well. But I don't think that application really makes sense if we look at the context and all things considered. First, which we didn't look at the details of Daniel chapter 11, but if you go back and read Daniel chapter 11, there's a lot of details given about the king of the north and the king of the south, and these battles and things that are going to take place. There's nothing mentioned in the context of Daniel chapter 12 about any kings of the north, any kings of the south. Nothing about wars or battles or anything like that. So, the appearance of Antiochus in this context would be terribly abrupt. I don't think it fits with anything that's mentioned here in these verses that we looked at this morning, especially in light of as much detail that is given around Antiochus in Daniel chapter 11. Second, Daniel's already given a prophecy regarding Antiochus' siege of Jerusalem and taking away the daily sacrifice. So he gave that in Daniel 11, which was written before Daniel 12, sometime before Daniel 12. So he's already given one prophecy. So why would he give, more or less of another prophecy that is more or less identical as far as referencing the same time frame of 3.5 years? So third, we know that Daniel chapter 12 was written after Daniel chapter 11. If you notice in verse 9, Daniel was told, "Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." So Daniel was given the prophecy in Daniel chapter 11. He was not told that the words were sealed up, but now he's told later, when he's given this vision in Daniel 12, that the words are sealed up. So the words being sealed up generally signifies something that's a long way off or something like that. So the prophecy here in Daniel 12 has to be something that's at least after the prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, because he wasn't told that the words were sealed in chapter 11, but he's told they were sealed here in Daniel chapter 12. So I think we can say we can see this implies that the events of Daniel 12 happened at least later than the events of Daniel chapter 11. So I think with all that, we can clearly see that the abomination of desolation that's referenced here in Daniel 12 is a different abomination of desolation mentioned in Daniel chapter 11. So the question to us is this the abomination of desolation mentioned by Jesus or referred to by Jesus in Daniel chapter or Matthew chapter 24? So if we look at the time frames given, we'll have to do a little bit of math this morning. Well, if we look at the time frames given, remember that the 1290 days is about 3.5 years. Turns out that Jesus' earthly ministry, his earthly ministry to the Jews, covered about 7 years, but it was broken up into 2 years of about 3.5 years each. Remember that Jesus' earthly ministry lasted about 3 years, it was about 3.5 years. Then he was put to death. We know that immediately after Jesus' death, the apostles continued his earthly ministry to the Jews for an additional roughly 3.5 years before the gospel was taken to the Gentiles. So if we think about that, I think that the 1290 days, it makes sense to see this references as Jesus' 3.5 years of ministry after his death. So this would be the 1290 days, I think, references the 3.5 year ministry to the Jews after Jesus' death, carried on by his apostles. So we do a little bit of math. So again, the 1335 days and 1290 days are running concurrently here. So the 1335 days is 45 days longer than the 1290 days. So I'm sorry, we're doing math. Nobody ever expects to be doing math in Bible class on Sunday morning. But for the 1335 days is 45 days longer than the 1290 days. So if what we're saying is correct, if the assumption we're saying that the 1290 days is referencing Jesus' 3.5 year ministry to the Jews after his death, carried on by his apostles, then the 1335 days would be 3.5 years after Jesus' death plus an additional 45 days. Turns out most scholars agree that this is exactly the time when the gospel was taken to the Gentiles, when the gospel was extended to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10, Acts chapter 11, around that time frame when you see that happening. So it's interesting to me that time frame sort of lines up, but the idea would be, what's the significance of this? If we go back to the verses, starting in verse number 11, from that time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. So Daniel sees this vision, and he's more or less told that there's going to be 1,290 days after the abomination of desolation is set up, but he that waits on the 1335 days, blessed is he. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh through the 1,305 and 30 days. So why would you be blessed to wait on the 1,335 days? Because now the gospel is taken to the whole world. Before it was taken just to the Jews. But so now after Jesus' death, after these additional 45 days, the gospel is taken to the whole world. So the thing that sticks out in my mind in this interpretation that we have to explain is, so this means that Jesus' death would be the abomination of desolation. How could we possibly explain that Jesus' death could be referred to as an abomination? Well, remember, if we said the abomination means detestable or abominable thing, right? It refers to something similar to, generally in reference to idolatry. But in reference to Jesus' death, there is no greater abomination, there is no greater detestable thing, I think, that mankind could do than reject the Son of God and then put him to death. So if we think about any abomination that mankind could do in reference to God, what greater abomination could we do than to kill the Son of God when he comes to earth? Remember in Matthew 23, verse 32, Jesus tells, this is in his talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees and those leaders, he tells them, fill you up then the measure of your fathers. And then we talked about this in our study in Matthew 23, how Jesus is basically telling them to finish what your father started, talking about killing of the prophets. And in that same context, Jesus basically gives them the prediction that this is what's going to be the end of Jerusalem. This is what's going to lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. Go ahead and finish what your father started. And he says, and then all the blood from righteous Abel to Zechariah is going to be brought upon this generation. So, I think that we can see as far as how could Jesus' death be an abomination. It's not that Jesus was an abomination in any way. It has nothing to do with Jesus. It has to do in the Jews' rejection and execution of Jesus. That would obviously be an abomination to God. And no greater abomination could I imagine that we could do than to kill God in the flesh itself, right? But so that fits the abomination part of it. How does the desolation part fit into it? How does Jesus' death have desolation associated with it? So in my mind, the desolation comes because Jesus' death took away the daily sacrifice. So if you remember again, Daniel chapter 12. Starting in verse 11, from that time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up. So the daily sacrifice will be taken away more or less simultaneously when the abomination of desolation is set up. So how does that refer to Jesus' sacrifice? How does this desolation taking away the daily sacrifice, how does this apply to Jesus' death, his death or his sacrifice? Well, in my mind, I think of it like this way. So when I was about 19 or 20, I went to my granny's house to do some work outside. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but it was either to cut the grass or help something outside. But it was a hot summer day, so I wore my old stained white T-shirt and a pair of ratty jeans that I wore that I worked outside in. So I go to Granny's house and work outside there in the day in the hot sun. There was something that I was planning to do that evening, so I took a change of clothes with me. When I got done working outside, I took a shower at Granny's house, changed my clothes, and left. And I forgot and left my dirty clothes there. Well, so then next time I was at Granny's house, she told me, I washed your clothes, they're in the other bedroom. So I'll go in there and get my clothes. I picked up my jeans. I recognized those jeans, but I didn't recognize this shirt. And I picked it up. This shirt was brand new, just absolutely spotless. And so I left the shirt. I told Granny, I said, well, I got my pants, but that ain't my shirt. And she said, that is your shirt. I said, I don't think that's my shirt, Granny. It's too clean to be my shirt. And she said, well, I washed it. And so it was at that point that I really realized the difference between Granny washing clothes and me washing clothes. So my shirt was clean because I had washed it. right? It didn't have any dirt on it, but it was still stained. It had those stains. So I should have. Again, I didn't know how to clean my clothes like Granny did, right? But I mean, my shirt was clean. I washed it, but it was still stained. I didn't get the stains out of it. And the shirt was clean, but it was still stained because it took something special to clean those stains away, right? It took Granny's way of cleaning this shirt to get the stains out of it. So I think of it that being a perfect example of why the blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin. If you think about how the New Testament talks about the blood of bulls and goats, we know that Jesus' sacrifice is so much more significant, so much more able to purge the sins of man. Why is that? It's because under the blood of bulls and goats, the souls of men could be clean by offering the blood of bulls and goats because it was done in accordance with God's will. So you could be clean in the reference that you followed God's will. But the blood of bulls and goats lacked that significant cleansing power to purge the souls of men from those stains of sin, right? And it wasn't until Jesus shed His blood that you had that perfect cleansing power that you could cleanse the souls of men from the stains of sin. I think that example, just like I needed Granny to wash my shirt to get it actually clean, we need Jesus to wash our souls to get them completely clean, to purge those sin stains from our soul. So once you do that, once you have the power, the cleansing power that cleanses you fully, why would you ever need to go back to the cleansing power that can only cleanse you partially? So once Jesus shed His blood for us, once He shed His blood on the cross, there was no more need for the blood of bulls and goats, because the blood of bulls and goats could only clean you partially to begin with. Now once you have this perfect cleansing power that can purge your soul of all sins completely, then it makes no sense to even offer the blood of bulls and goats even more, because they could only clean you partially. So when we talk about the desolation part of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11, I think this is what it's referencing. The daily sacrifices would be taken away because once Jesus' blood was shed, once the abomination of desolation was set up, once Jesus was rejected and executed by the Jews, and His blood was shed, the daily sacrifice was taken away because there was no more need for the daily sacrifice. The perfect sacrifice had already been offered, and our sins can now be completely purged from our souls. Those stains could be completely purged from our souls, and we didn't need the blood of bulls and goats anymore. They could only partially clean us. So that's how I see the interpretation of the abomination of desolation here in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. This is in reference to, the abomination of desolation is in reference to the crucifixion of Jesus and the end of the Old Testament sacrifices, the Old Testament daily sacrifices being offered because they were no longer needed after the shedding of Jesus' blood. So I think this is what this context is talking about. I think we can see that I don't think this fits with the context of Matthew 24, when Jesus says the abomination of desolation is spoken of by Daniel. There could be a few reasons. I think just obviously it doesn't fit the context. Number one, when Jesus tells them when the abomination of desolation is set up, they're to flee to the mountains. We know that the disciples did not flee to the mountains. Those that were in Judea did not flee to the mountains when Jesus was executed. We know that the idea of that doesn't fit, doesn't really make sense in the context. Why would they flee to the mountains? Because of Jesus' crucifixion. Even if you look in the context of the early chapters there of Acts, we know that the apostles were scared and they were sort of hiding out, but they didn't flee to the mountains, right? Even if we look at it from that perspective, just to say, for the sake of argument, maybe a handful of people fled Jerusalem because of their fear of the Jews, but we see it in no way did the Christians or the followers, disciples of Jesus, flee Judea to the mountains after the crucifixion of Jesus. So the last remaining mention of the abomination of desolations in Daniel chapter 9. We'll look at that last week because I wanted to make sure that we have enough time to look at the whole context, the whole study there. We'll end up studying actually, a good portion of the chapter of Daniel chapter 9. So I want to make sure that we got enough time to study all that. But so we'll finish a few minutes early this morning. Anybody have any comments or questions about the lesson, the study this morning? I know there was a lot of information. We went through it, sort of rapidly, but trying to make the best use of our time. We could really study this. We could really have made a Bible study just on these, just on the book of Daniel, just on these prophecies and studying these prophecies of Daniel. But anybody have any comments or questions about what we've talked about this morning? All right, thank you.